A little while back, while scrolling through eBay, I found this, whatever this is. At first, I thought it was just your run-of-the-mill cheap eBay graphics card, but this one was different, given its two 6-pin power connectors. The reason this is significant is that you don't often see that on cards selling for under $20. At that price point, most are either underpowered low-profile cards for office PCs, old quadros that nobody wants, broken, or a combination of all three. So, seeing something with a substantial power draw was a nice change of pace. At first, I didn't really want to buy it, but was intrigued by the unique cooling solution and the fact that I couldn't find this specific model online. I even tried reverse image searching with the pictures provided by the seller, but found none with the same cooler. I mean, look at it. It looks so horribly out of place, like it was screwed in only because the holes coincidentally lined up. And I wanted to test this questionable cooler. After a while, I still couldn't find an exact match, but I did have a vague idea that helped me narrow down the possibilities. The first thing I noticed was, obviously, the two 6-pin connectors. This told me that it was likely once a high-end model, since, in general, cheaper graphics cards consume less power. I also knew that it had to be before the 2009 to 2010 era, because it was in those years that the first mainstream cards were released with HDMI ports, something this one didn't have. This all restricted my options to a higher-end ATI card from the late 2000s. This leaves me with the HD 4860, 4870, and 4890 because I also knew that the 4850 only required a single 6-pin connector, and the 4850 X2 and 4870 X2 were all dual GPU cards. But before I reveal which model it is, take a guess and let me know in the comments below. When the package first reached my doorstep, the first thing I noticed was the lack of packing material. It was just kind of wrapped in some thick paper and shoved into an envelope. Ignoring that, I reached in and pulled out a HD 4870, one of the cards I predicted it could be. This would have set you back about $300 in 2008, but in 2021 I got it for just $15. Not too shabby. The first thing I noticed was a distinctive curvature to the PCB. Don't know if it was sold like that or it was damaged in shipping, but either way, this card has seen a rough time. Hopefully, it'll work just fine. Also, now that I could clearly see the model number, I entered it into Google to see if the cooling solution was stock. And to my surprise, it was. Apparently, the exact same heatsink I earlier doubted was the entire selling point of this card, featuring the exclusive 5.8 ounce copper rod glaciator, which is up to 12 degrees Celsius cooler than a reference HD 4870. Looking into this glaciator series, found that it was a design by Asus, only ever utilized on the GTX 260 in the HD 4000 series in late 2008. I thought that maybe the short runtime of the model meant that it was flawed, but user reviews from the time stated it was a great card that stayed cool with plenty of overclocking headroom, easily outperforming the 9800 GTX Plus. After a little more digging, I found another old forum discussing the card, stating, basically, the Glaciator is fast becoming the IBM Death Star of video card coolers, and Asus knows it. The Death Star phrase references IBM's old Desk Star hard drives that were notoriously unreliable. This didn't shine a good light on the Glaciator, so maybe this heatsink wasn't all it's cracked up to be. Another post explained how they had an HD 4850 with a similar heatsink and that the fan failed after 2 months, accompanied by a loud noise and high operating temperatures. Unfortunately, other users also mentioned similar experiences. Then again, the 4850 version only ever shipped with the Glaciator heatsink, rather than the Glaciator Plus found on today's 4870. So hopefully our version will hold up a bit better. I really don't know what to expect. After a quick power on test to make sure that the card worked, I cleaned it up a bit. It wasn't necessarily dirty, but you couldn't call it clean. It was regularly used, so I replaced the thermal paste to ensure it would perform ideally. But what exactly was under that infamous heatsink? Well, built on the unified superscalar shader architecture and fabricated on the 55nm process, this version came clocked at 750 MHz with 800 stream processors, 40 texture units, and 16 render output units. This model also had 1 whole gigabyte of GDDR5 memory, clocked at 900 MHz with a 256-bit bus width. Only downside is that it was meant for PCIe 2.0 and had a TDP of 150 watts. After it was all cleaned up and repasted, I threw the card into today's test bench system. With an FX 8350 and 32GB of RAM, this GPU will easily be the bottleneck of the system, so this is really a best case scenario for the card. Another thing to note is that today's testing will be done on Windows 10. Officially, this card is only supported up to Windows 8, but from other user reports it seems that the drivers work just fine on 10. It also only supports up to DirectX 10.1, so we are going to be limited in the age range of games. But without further ado, let's get right into testing. After installing the drivers, the first thing I did was run Userbenchmark to ensure all hardware was performing as expected, and the results were promising. All components scored over the 50 percentile, so they were performing at least a little above average. With the preliminary testing completed, I first sought to answer the question, can it run CRYSIS? And yeah, it can. Pretty well too. In this clip, I played a bit of CRYSIS Warhead, and the 4870 did not disappoint. In 1080p with the mainstream, aka medium, settings applied, the average frame rate was a solid 48 FPS. It did occasionally drop down when there was a lot going on, but it ran very well. I could easily play through the entire game using these settings. After that was a much easier game, Half-Life 2. Obviously, this game ran great in 1080p with high settings and achieved an average frame rate of 183 FPS. But that's to be expected, considering the game was released 5 years before the 4870. The only real performance dip occurred when the alien did some green thing, which nearly halved the frame rate for a second or two. But aside from that, it ran very well. The next game I tested was Counter-Strike Global Offensive, released 4 years after this GPU. Even though the game is harder to run nowadays than it was back when it was released, the 4870 was consistently pushing a solid 60 to 90 FPS in 1080p with high settings. My framerate software decided not to work for whatever reason, so I pulled those figures from the little counter provided by Steam. Regardless, with this performance, you could easily competitively play CSGO, although I wouldn't recommend that. The next game I tested was Grand Theft Auto 5. Although this was by far the hardest game I ran on this system, the results weren't disappointing at all. In 1080p with normal settings, the average frame rate came to be an acceptable 35 FPS. Playable, but not necessarily good. Dropping the resolution down to 720p saw a slight increase to 39 FPS, but the game still felt the same, just looked worse. There was also a fair bit of stuttering, but it still felt like performance was just good enough for the game to be considered playable through and through. After that was the Noita test. Most of you probably don't know this game, but if you're a masochist, you'll love it. I figured maybe the whole every pixel is a physics object thing would slow down performance a bit, but it didn't. In 1080p with the highest settings, the average frame rate was a smooth 60 FPS, only dipping below that figure when large explosions occurred. All in all, completely playable, with plenty of room to spare. The last two titles were games more appropriate to the time in which this card was released. Debuting in 2007, Bioshock was the first one up. In 1080p with high settings, the average frame rate was a smooth 56 FPS, more than enough to experience this game with. Finally, the last game I tested was 2012's Dishonored. When this game was released, the 4870 would have already been 4 years old, but it held up pretty well. In 1080p with the highest settings, the average frame rate was a flawless 60 FPS, almost never dipping below. There's a lot of good games from this early 2010s era, so if you're looking to play them, this card will have more than enough performance for you. I mentioned earlier that some users found substantial overclocking potential in this card, so I tried a bit myself. For reference, the stock clocks of this model were 750 MHz on the core and 900 MHz on the memory. The highest I was able to push these figures before artifacting or crashing was 825 on the core and 1080 on the memory, so plus 75 and plus 180 respectively. With these higher settings, I ran GTA again in 1080p and got an average frame rate of, drumroll please, 37 FPS, a whole 2 frames per second more. That is so little I can hardly even attribute the increased performance to the overclock. Either way, that was as far as the card would let me push it, so I guess any increase is better than nothing at all. Another aspect to consider from the previous test was the heat, as that was kind of the entire selling point of the Glaciator Plus heatsink. The whole 12 degrees Celsius cooler thing, remember? Anyways, throughout testing, the hottest the 4870 ever got was 68 degrees Celsius, and that's not too bad, even by modern day standards. So I guess Asus delivered, and this 13-year-old heatsink still holds up today. I wonder what would happen if I put it on a 1080 Ti though. But with great cooling came great ambient noise levels. Overall, these weren't so bad. The fan never seemed to reach 100% during testing, so to hear the true noise potential of this card, I hopped into MSI Afterburner and manually maxed it out. This caused it to easily become the loudest component of this system, but it wasn't horrible. Not any worse than your average 2080 or 3070 nowadays. One thing I did notice is that even at idle, the fan speed defaulted to 50%. Not sure exactly why the manufacturer chose to do this, but I think this constant utilization may have been contributing to the fan failure mentioned in earlier posts. In conclusion, although this card literally isn't in the best shape, it can still pull some decent frame rates. If you're waiting to snag a reasonably priced 3060 from Newegg Shuffle and need something cheap to tide you over for a month or two, this might not be a bad choice. Well, only if you plan on playing games that support DirectX 10. You could also maybe use this card in an ultra low budget build designed to play older games for cheap. I don't know, I'm kinda grasping for straws here. But hey, this old card outperforms a GT 730 any day of the week, and more of those are sold every day on Amazon. Really, the main downside to this card was the lack of support. I downloaded a few games I thought for sure would be able to run on this card, and they probably would have, if it supported DirectX 11. I'd say that's the main limiting factor of this GPU, the lack of support. Oh, and we also have a community Discord server where we discuss a variety of topics, link in the description. Regardless, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or related comments, then leave them below and I'll be sure to respond to it. While you're at it, consider subscribing or leaving a like because it genuinely helps me out. And that's about it. Have a great day. Bye.